Today, we are diving into the fascinating world of the Norse civilization, known for their unparalleled seafaring skills. This video will guide you through their origins, culture, and maritime expertise. The Norse civilization, commonly known as the Vikings, originated from the Scandinavian regions of modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These lands, characterized by rugged coastlines and fjords, heavily influenced their seafaring nature. The harsh climate and limited arable land pushed the Norse people to the seas. Early Norse society was primarily agrarian, but their geographical constraints necessitated exploration and expansion. Their maritime skills were not just for raiding but also for trade and colonization. Norsemen were known for their longships, which were crucial for their expeditions. These ships were fast, durable, and could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. The Norse culture was deeply intertwined with their mythology and belief in gods like Odin and Thor. These deities played significant roles in their daily lives and motivated their explorations. Understanding their origins gives us insight into their later exploits across Europe and beyond. The earliest Norse settlements date back to around 800 AD, marking the start of what is known as the Viking Age. During this period, the Norse began to expand their territories through both violent raids and peaceful settlements. The Viking Age is often depicted as a time of brutal invasions, but the Norse were also skilled traders and settlers. They established trade routes that connected them with the Byzantine Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, and other distant lands. Their seafaring abilities were unmatched, allowing them to explore and settle in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. The Norse were also known for their craftsmanship, particularly in shipbuilding and metalwork. Their longships, with their distinctive dragon-headed prows, became symbols of their maritime dominance. The Norse also had a rich oral tradition, passing down sagas and stories that chronicled their history and exploits. These stories were eventually written down, providing invaluable historical records. The Viking Age was a time of great change and expansion for the Norse people. Norse society was structured around a clan system, with family ties and loyalty playing central roles. The basic social unit was the family or household, which included extended family members and slaves. The head of the household, usually a male, held significant power and responsibility. Norse clans were part of larger communities known as things, which were assemblies that met to discuss and resolve disputes. These assemblies were crucial for maintaining order and making important decisions. The thing was also a place where laws were made and justice was administered. Norse law was complex and relied heavily on oral tradition, with law speakers reciting the laws from memory. This system of governance ensured that power was distributed and that no single individual could dominate. Despite their reputation as fierce warriors, the Norse placed a high value on legal and social order. This structure helped them maintain stability and cohesion within their communities. The Norse religion was polytheistic, with a pantheon of gods and goddesses who governed various aspects of life and nature. The chief god, Odin, was associated with wisdom, war, and death. Thor, another prominent deity, was the god of thunder, lightning, and protection. These gods were believed to reside in Asgard, one of the 9 worlds connected by the cosmic tree Yggdrasil. The Norse also believed in an afterlife, with warriors aspiring to reach Valhalla, a hall where they would join Odin's army. Religious practices included sacrifices, feasts, and rituals conducted by priests known as Gor. These rituals were often held in sacred groves or at altars called Horgr. The Norse also believed in fate, which was determined by the Norns, free mythical beings who controlled destiny. Magic and prophecy were significant aspects of their belief system, with seers and shamans playing important roles. The rich mythology and religious practices of the Norse deeply influenced their culture and worldview. The Norse were also accomplished farmers, hunters, and fishers, utilizing the natural resources of their environment. Their agricultural practices included growing crops like barley, oats, and rye, as well as raising livestock such as cattle, sheep, and pigs. The harsh climate and short growing season in Scandinavia made farming challenging, but the Norse adapted with techniques like crop rotation and fertilization. Hunting and fishing were vital for supplementing their diet, providing meat, fish, and furs. The Norse were skilled at exploiting their natural surroundings, using tools and techniques that maximized their yields. They also engaged in trade, exchanging goods like furs, walrus ivory, and fish with neighboring cultures. This trade network extended as far as the Middle East, bringing wealth and foreign influences into Norse society. The Norse diet was diverse and included dairy products, bread, and preserved foods. Their resourcefulness and adaptability were key to their survival and prosperity in a harsh environment. One of the most iconic aspects of Norse culture was their longships, which were crucial for their seafaring activities. These ships were marvels of engineering, designed for speed, agility, and versatility. Longships could be propelled by both sails and oars, allowing them to navigate various waters. They were also capable of beaching, making them ideal for quick raids and retreats. The design of these ships evolved over time, with advancements in shipbuilding techniques and materials. Longships varied in size and purpose, from small coastal vessels to large ocean-going ships. They were often adorned with carvings and decorations, reflecting the craftsmanship and artistry of the Norse. The construction of a longship required skilled labor and significant resources, indicating their importance in Norse society. These ships were not only tools of war, but also symbols of status and power. The Norse mastery of shipbuilding and navigation was a key factor in their success as explorers and warriors. The Norse expansion was driven by various factors, including population pressure, political instability, and economic opportunities. The limited arable land in Scandinavia could not support a growing population, prompting many Norse to seek new territories. Internal conflicts and power struggles also contributed to the desire for expansion. The allure of wealth and resources in foreign lands was a powerful motivator for Norse warriors and traders. The first recorded Viking raid occurred in 793 AD at the monastery of Lindisfarne in England, marking the beginning of the Viking Age. This raid was followed by numerous others across Europe, targeting monasteries, towns, and trade centers. The Norse were feared for their sudden and devastating attacks, but they also established settlements and integrated with local populations. Their expansion was not solely about conquest, but also about exploration and trade. Norse traders traveled as far as the Middle East, bringing back exotic goods and influencing local cultures. The Norse expansion reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Europe and beyond. The Norse established significant settlements in various parts of Europe, including the British Isles, Ireland, and France. In England, they founded the Danelaw, a region where Norse law and customs prevailed. This area included parts of modern-day Yorkshire, East Anglia, and the East Midlands. The Norse also settled in Ireland, establishing key cities like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. These settlements became important centers of trade and commerce, integrating Norse and Gaelic cultures. In France, the Norse established the Duchy of Normandy, which would later play a crucial role in European history. The settlement of Normandy was formalized in 911 AD when the Frankish king granted land to the Norse leader Rollo. The Norse influence in these regions extended beyond their initial conquests, affecting language, law, and culture. Their ability to adapt and integrate with local populations was a key factor in their success as settlers. The legacy of Norse settlements is still evident in the place names, traditions, and genetic heritage of these regions. The Norse also ventured into the Atlantic, discovering and settling in new lands such as Iceland, Greenland, and Finland. Iceland was first settled around 874 AD by Norse chieftains fleeing political turmoil in Norway. The harsh but resource-rich environment of Iceland allowed the settlers to establish a thriving society. They created a unique system of governance with the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliaments. From Iceland, Norse explorers continued westward, reaching Greenland around 985 AD under the leadership of Eric the Red. The Norse settlements in Greenland survived for several centuries, relying on hunting, farming, and trade. The most famous Norse exploration was led by Leif Erikson, who reached the shores of North America, known to the Norse as Vinland, around the year 1000 AD. This discovery predates Columbus's voyage by nearly 500 years, showcasing the Norse's remarkable navigational skills. Although the Vinland settlements were short-lived, they represent the farthest extent of Norse exploration. These Atlantic ventures highlight the Norse's daring spirit and their quest for new horizons. Norse art and culture were rich and diverse, reflecting their seafaring lifestyle and interaction with other cultures. Norse art is characterized by intricate designs and motifs, often depicting scenes from mythology and nature. Common themes included animals, gods, and geometric patterns, crafted into jewelry, weapons, and household items. The Norse were skilled metalworkers, producing finely decorated swords, axes, and helmets. Their craftsmanship extended to wood carving, with elaborate decorations on ships, buildings, and furniture. Norse literature is best known for the sagas, epic tales that recount the deeds of heroes, kings, and gods. These stories were passed down orally before being written down in the medieval period. The sagas provide valuable insights into Norse society, culture, and beliefs, revealing a world of honor, bravery, and adventure. The Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda are two of the most important collections of these tales, preserving the mythology and history of the Norse people. The Norse also had a rich tradition of runic inscriptions, using the runic alphabet known as Futhart. These inscriptions were used for everything from memorial stones to everyday messages, showcasing their written language and literacy. Norse culture was dynamic and multifaceted, enriched by their seafaring experiences and interactions with other civilizations. The Norse legal system was sophisticated and played a crucial role in their society. Law was a communal affair, with disputes being settled in assemblies called things. The most important of these was the Althing in Iceland, which served as both a legislative and judicial body. Laws were recited by the law speaker, an official who memorized and proclaimed the laws. Legal disputes were resolved through trials, which could involve oaths, witnesses, and sometimes combat. The Norse also had a concept of wergild, a compensation payment for injuries or deaths, to avoid blood feuds. This system aimed to maintain peace and order within the community. Women had significant rights in Norse law, including property ownership and the ability to divorce. The legal system reflects the Norse emphasis on fairness, justice, and community cohesion. It also highlights their pragmatic approach to governance and conflict resolution. Norse trade was extensive and connected them to a wide network of cultures across Europe and Asia. They traded goods such as furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves in exchange for silver, spices, silk, and other luxury items. The Norse established trade routes that reached from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean and beyond. Key trading centers included Hedeby, Birka, and York, which became bustling hubs of commerce. The Norse used a variety of currencies, including hack silver, pieces of cut-up silver, and foreign coins, to facilitate trade. Their involvement in trade brought them into contact with many different peoples and cultures, influencing their own society. Norse traders were known for their fair dealings and reliability, which earned them respect and trust. This extensive trade network helped to spread Norse culture and technology, as well as bringing new ideas and goods to their homeland. Trade was a vital component of Norse economy and a driving force behind their seafaring ventures. Norse exploration and colonization had a profound impact on the regions they settled. In the British Isles, Norse settlers influenced the local culture, language, and political structures. Place names in England and Scotland, such as those ending in by or Thorpe, reflect Norse origins. In Ireland, the Norse established major towns that became key centers of commerce and culture. The Norse presence in Normandy led to the rise of the Normans, who would later conquer England in 1066 AD. In the North Atlantic, Norse settlers transformed Iceland and Greenland into thriving communities. Their explorations in North America, though short-lived, left a lasting legacy of curiosity and adventure. Norse colonization often involved both cooperation and conflict with local populations. They adapted to and influenced the cultures they encountered, creating a legacy of cultural exchange. The Norse impact on these regions is still evident today in language, culture, and genetics. The end of the Viking Age is generally marked by the Christianization of the Norse and the consolidation of centralized kingdoms. The conversion to Christianity began in the 10th century and was largely complete by the 12th century. Christianization brought significant changes to Norse society, including the construction of churches and the adoption of new laws. It also marked the end of many traditional practices, such as pagan sacrifices and rituals. The process of conversion was complex, involving both voluntary acceptance and coercion by Christian rulers. The establishment of centralized kingdoms in Scandinavia helped to stabilize the region and integrate it into broader European political structures. The end of the Viking Age did not mean the end of Norse influence. Rather, it marked the beginning of a new era. Norse culture and traditions continued to evolve, blending with Christian and European influences. The legacy of the Norse persisted in their descendants, who played significant roles in medieval European history. The Norse influence extended beyond their own time, shaping the course of European history. The Normans, descendants of the Norse settlers in France, played a crucial role in the medieval period. They were instrumental in the conquest of England and the establishment of a powerful dynasty. The Norse also left a lasting impact on the legal and cultural practices of the regions they settled. Their seafaring skills and exploration inspired later generations of explorers and navigators. The tales of Viking voyages and adventures continued to captivate and influence European literature and folklore. The Norse legacy is evident in modern-day Scandinavia, where their cultural heritage is celebrated and preserved. The Viking Age, though often romanticized, remains a pivotal chapter in European history. The Norse contributions to exploration, trade, and cultural exchange had a lasting impact on the world. Their legacy is a testament to their resilience, ingenuity, and adventurous spirit. Norse mythology and literature have had a lasting influence on Western culture. The gods and heroes of Norse myths have inspired countless works of art, literature, and film. Characters like Thor, Odin, and Loki are well known in modern popular culture, especially through comic books and movies. The themes of bravery, adventure, and fate in Norse mythology resonate with audiences even today. The epic tales of the sagas continue to be studied and appreciated for their literary and historical value. Norse mythology also influenced the works of famous writers, such as J.R.R. Tolkien, who drew inspiration from these ancient stories. The rich symbolism and complex characters of Norse myths offer timeless lessons and insights. The preservation and study of Norse literature help us understand the values and beliefs of the Norse people. This cultural heritage continues to be a source of fascination and inspiration worldwide. Norse mythology's enduring popularity is a testament to its powerful storytelling and universal themes. The archaeological record provides valuable insights into Norse life and society. Excavations of Norse settlements, burial sites, and shipwrecks have revealed details about their daily lives, trade, and warfare. Famous sites like the Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials in Norway offer glimpses into the wealth and craftsmanship of the Norse elite. Artifacts such as tools, weapons, jewelry, and household items illustrate the Norse's skilled craftsmanship and diverse activities. The remains of longhouses and fortifications show the architectural ingenuity and social organization of Norse communities. Archaeological discoveries in places like York, Dublin, and Iceland have uncovered the extent of Norse influence and settlement. These findings also reveal the interactions between the Norse and the local populations they encountered. The study of runestones and inscriptions adds to our understanding of Norse language and communication. Archaeology helps us reconstruct the past and gain a deeper appreciation of Norse achievements and contributions. The ongoing research and discoveries continue to expand our knowledge of this fascinating civilization. The Norse had a profound respect for the natural world, which is reflected in their mythology and daily practices. Their gods and myths often embodied natural elements, such as Thor's control over thunder and Freyr's association with fertility and agriculture. This connection to nature influenced their agricultural practices, hunting techniques, and resource management. The Norse were adept at using the natural resources available to them, from fishing and whaling to mining and forestry. They developed sustainable practices to ensure the longevity of their resources, such as crop rotation and selective hunting. Their respect for nature also extended to their navigation skills, as they relied on the stars, winds, and ocean currents for guidance. This deep connection to the natural world is evident in their art and literature, which frequently depict animals, landscapes, and natural phenomena. The Norse's understanding and reverence for nature were integral to their survival and success. Their ability to adapt and thrive in diverse and challenging environments is a testament to their ingenuity and resourcefulness. The Norse also made significant contributions to maritime technology and navigation. Their advancements in shipbuilding, such as the clinker-built method, allowed them to construct sturdy and versatile vessels. The longship, with its shallow draft and symmetrical design, was capable of navigating both deep seas and shallow rivers. This versatility made it ideal for raiding, trading, and exploring. The Norse also used a variety of navigational tools and techniques, including sunstones, to determine the position of the sun on cloudy days. They relied on natural signs, such as bird flight patterns and sea currents, to guide their journeys. These skills enabled them to venture far from their homelands and establish trade routes and settlements across Europe and the North Atlantic. The Norse's maritime maritime expertise was not only crucial for their own expansion but also influenced other cultures and civilizations. Their innovations in shipbuilding and navigation set new standards and were adopted by other seafaring peoples. The legacy of Norse maritime prowess continues to be recognized and celebrated today. The social structure of Norse society was complex and multifaceted, with various classes and roles. At the top were the jarls, or nobles, who owned large estates and wielded significant power. Below them were the carls, or free farmers and craftsmen, who made up the majority of the population. The thralls, or slaves, occupied the lowest social rung and were often captives from raids or born into servitude. Despite this hierarchy, Norse society was relatively fluid, with opportunities for mobility through marriage, wealth, and achievement. Women in Norse society had considerable rights and could own property, run businesses, and seek divorce. They played vital roles in both the household and the community, managing farms and participating in trade. The family unit was central to Norse life, with strong kinship ties and a sense of collective responsibility. Hospitality was highly valued, and guests were treated with great respect and generosity. This social structure helped maintain order and cohesion within Norse communities, enabling them to thrive in diverse environments. The Norse social system reflects their pragmatic approach to governance and their emphasis on community and family. The Norse also had a unique approach to warfare, characterized by their use of surprise attacks and mobile tactics. Their raids were often swift and devastating, targeting unprotected coastal settlements and monasteries. The element of surprise was crucial to their success, allowing them to strike quickly and retreat before organized resistance could form. Norse warriors were known for their ferocity and skill in battle, wielding weapons like swords, axes, and spears. They also used a variety of defensive equipment, including helmets, shields, and chainmail. The Norse had a strong martial culture, with training and warrior ethos deeply ingrained from a young age. The concept of the berserker, a warrior who fought with uncontrollable rage, is a well-known aspect of Norse warfare. Their military tactics and strategies evolved over time, adapting to different enemies and terrains. The Norse also engaged in larger-scale conflicts and sieges, demonstrating their versatility as warriors. Their approach to warfare, combining surprise, mobility, and ferocity, made them formidable opponents and successful conquerors. Norse women played significant roles in their society, contributing to both the household and the broader community. They were responsible for managing the household, raising children, and overseeing farm work in their husband's absence. Norse women were also involved in trade and commerce, running businesses and participating in markets. They had legal rights, including property ownership and the ability to seek divorce, which provided them with a degree of independence. Some women, known as shield maidens, were even said to have participated in warfare, though the extent of this is debated. The sagas and historical records mention women who held significant influence and power, such as queens and chieftains' wives. The role of women in Norse society was multifaceted, reflecting the pragmatic and flexible nature of their culture. Their contributions were vital to the functioning and success of Norse communities. The respect and rights afforded to women in Norse society were relatively progressive for the time, highlighting their importance in both domestic and public spheres. The Norse religious beliefs and practices were deeply intertwined with their daily lives and worldview. They believed in a pantheon of gods and goddesses who influenced various aspects of nature and human existence. Rituals and sacrifices were conducted to honor these deities and seek their favor, often involving offerings of food, animals, or valuable items. The Norse also held festivals and feasts to celebrate important events and seasonal changes, which were occasions for community bonding and religious observance. These practices were led by religious leaders known as Gor, who played important roles in both spiritual and political spheres. The Norse believed in an afterlife, with different realms such as Valhalla for warriors and Hel for those who did not die in battle. Their myths and legends, recorded in the sagas and Eddas, provided a rich tapestry of stories that explained natural phenomena and human behavior. These beliefs and practices gave the Norse a sense of purpose and connection to the cosmos. The transition to Christianity in the later Viking Age marked a significant cultural shift, but also demonstrated the adaptability of Norse society. The Norse were also skilled craftsmen and artists, creating beautiful and functional items from a variety of materials. Their metalwork was particularly renowned, with finely crafted weapons, jewelry, and tools. Norse smiths used techniques such as pattern welding to create strong and intricate designs in their blades. Woodworking was another important craft, with detailed carvings adorning everything from ships to household items. The Norse also excelled in textile production, weaving wool and linen into clothing, sails, and other goods. Their artistry extended to everyday items, reflecting a culture that valued beauty and utility. The Oseberg ship burial, for example, contained a wealth of beautifully crafted objects that showcased the Norse's artistic skills. Norse art often featured interlacing patterns, animals, and mythological scenes, blending form and function. These crafts and arts were not only practical but also served as expressions of identity and status. The legacy of Norse craftsmanship can still be seen in the surviving artifacts and the influence on later European art and design. Norse explorers and settlers often established cooperative relationships with the local populations they encountered. In some cases, they intermarried and integrated with these communities, creating a blend of cultures and traditions. This was particularly evident in places like Ireland, Scotland, and Normandy, where Norse and local customs merged. The Norse brought their own agricultural techniques, crafts, and trade networks, enhancing the local economies. They also adopted aspects of the cultures they encountered, such as clothing styles, language, and building techniques. These interactions were not always peaceful, but over time, they often led to mutual benefit and cultural exchange. The Norse ability to adapt and integrate was a key factor in their successful expansion and settlement. This blending of cultures left a lasting legacy in the regions affected, visible in place names, genetic heritage, and cultural practices. The Norse's openness to new ideas and willingness to adapt were crucial to their enduring influence. Norse literature, especially the sagas, provides a rich and detailed account of their history, beliefs, and way of life. The sagas were originally passed down orally before being written down in the medieval period. They cover a wide range of topics, including heroic deeds, family feuds, voyages, and encounters with the supernatural. The sagas are not only valuable historical sources, but also literary masterpieces, known for their narrative style and vivid characters. They offer insights into the values and priorities of Norse society, such as honor, loyalty, and the importance of kinship. The Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda are two of the most significant collections of Norse mythology and heroic legends. These works, attributed to Snorri Sturluson and other medieval Icelandic authors, preserve the rich oral traditions of the Norse. The sagas and Eddas continue to be studied and appreciated for their historical, cultural, and literary significance. They are a testament to the Norse's storytelling prowess and their desire to record and remember their history. The Norse's seafaring skills were not only crucial for their own expansion, but also had a broader impact on maritime history. Their advancements in shipbuilding and navigation set new standards and were adopted by other seafaring cultures. The clinker-built method, used to construct their sturdy and versatile longships, influenced shipbuilding techniques across Europe. The Norse's ability to navigate the open seas and rivers with precision contributed to the development of maritime exploration. Their voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and North America demonstrated the possibilities of long-distance sea travel. The Norse's maritime legacy inspired later explorers, such as those during the Age of Discovery. Their seafaring traditions also contributed to the development of coastal trade networks and the exchange of goods and ideas. The Norse's impact on maritime history is a testament to their ingenuity and adventurous spirit. Their legacy continues to be recognized and celebrated in maritime museums and historical reenactments. The Norse's interactions with other cultures were complex and multifaceted, involving both conflict and cooperation. Their raids and invasions brought them into direct confrontation with various European kingdoms and empires. These conflicts often resulted in temporary settlements and the establishment of Norse control in certain regions. However, the Norse were also traders and settlers who established long-term relationships with local populations. In places like Russia, the Norse, known as Varangians, integrated into the local society and played significant roles in the formation of early states. The Norse also served as mercenaries and bodyguards, known as the Varangian Guard, for the Byzantine emperors. These interactions facilitated cultural exchange and the spread of Norse influence. The Norse's ability to adapt and integrate with different cultures was a key factor in their success. Their legacy is evident in the lasting cultural and genetic imprints they left on the regions they interacted with. The Norse's impact on European history and culture is still evident today in various forms. The influence of Norse language can be seen in the many English words of Old Norse origin, such as sky, egg, and knife. Norse mythology and legends continue to inspire modern literature, films, and art. The Viking Age has become a popular subject of historical study
Today,
and public
we will explore the
fascination,
roots of this
with
fascinating
numerous
culture
books,
that thrived in
documentaries,
Scandinavia.
and museums
The Norse,
dedicated to the
often referred
Norse.
to as
Festivals and
Vikings, are known for their
reenactments
seafaring
celebrate
skills,
Norse culture and
mythology, and
heritage,
impact on
attracting
Europe.
enthusiasts and scholars
Today,
alike.
we
The
will explore the
exploration
roots
of
of this
Norse
fascinating
history
culture that
provides
thrived in
valuable
Scandinavia.
insights into the early
The
medieval
Norse,
period
often
and the
referred to as
dynamics of
Vikings,
cultural
are known for their
exchange and
seafaring
conflict.
skills,
The Norse's
mythology, and
contributions
impact
to
on
trade,
Europe.
exploration, and
Today,
maritime
we will explore the
technology
roots of
are
this fascinating
recognized
culture
as
that thrived
significant
in Scandinavia.
milestones in human history.
The Norse,
Their
often
legacy
referred
is a
to as
reminder
Vikings,
of the
are known for
importance
their
of
seafaring
adaptability,
skills, mythology,
innovation,
and
and the
impact on
spirit of
Europe.
adventure. The enduring fascination
we
with
will
the
explore
Norse
the roots of this
reflects their
fascinating
remarkable
culture that
impact
thrived in
on the world.
Scandinavia.
In conclusion,
The
the
Norse,
Norse
often referred to
civilization,
as Vikings,
with its
are
seafaring
known for their
prowess,
seafaring
cultural
skills,
richness,
mythology,
and
and
historical
impact on Europe.
impact, remains a fascinating
Today, we
subject
will
of
explore
study.
the roots
From
of
their
this fascinating
origins in the
culture that thrived in
Scandinavian
Scandinavia.
heartlands, the Norse ventured
Norse,
far
often
and
referred
wide,
to as
leaving an
Vikings, are
indelible
known for their
mark on the
seafaring
regions
skills,
they explored
mythology,
and
and
settled.
impact
Their
on Europe.
advancements in shipbuilding and
Today,
navigation
we will
were key
explore
to
the
their
roots of this
success as
fascinating culture that
explorers,
thrived in
traders,
Scandinavia.
and warriors. The
The Norse,
Norse's
often
social
referred to
structure,
as Vikings,
legal
are
system,
known for their
and religious
seafaring
beliefs
skills,
reflect a
mythology, and
society
impact
that
on
valued
Europe.
community, justice,
Today,
and connection
we will
to the
explore the
natural
roots of this
world. Their
fascinating culture
literature,
that thrived in
mythology,
Scandinavia.
and craftsmanship
The Norse,
continue to
often referred
captivate
to
and
as
inspire
Vikings,
people
are known
today.
for their
The
seafaring
legacy of the
skills,
Norse is
mythology,
evident in
and
the
impact on
languages,
Europe.
cultures, and histories
Today,
of the
we will
regions
explore
they
the roots of this
influenced.
fascinating
Their
culture
story
that
is one
thrived
of
in
resilience,
Scandinavia.
adaptability,
The Norse,
and a
often
relentless
referred to as
quest for
Vikings,
new
are known for
horizons.
their
Don't
seafaring
forget to
skills,
like this video
mythology,
and subscribe
impact
to the
on Europe.
channel.